There is a place in the old world where the stones remember, but the trees remember longer. Picture an oak grove at twilight. The light is failing, and the spaces between the trunks have grown dark. There is no roof here, no altar carved by human hands, no inscription to tell you what happened in this spot. Only the trees. Only the moss. Only the silence of a place that has been waiting for thousands of years. Everyone in the settlement knows that the grove belongs to someone else. It belongs to the ones who know the language of roots and rain, the ones who can read the future in the flight of birds and the patterns of smoke, the ones who do not need stone walls because the forest itself is their cathedral. For centuries, before the first Viking longship scraped against the rocks of Scotland, before a single Christian bell rang out across Ireland, before the Romans ever set foot on British soil, these groves were the centers of power in the Celtic world, not castles, not temples of marble. And the people who tended them were called the Druids. We know almost nothing about them. I mean that literally. They were among the most educated people in the ancient world. They memorized a body of lore so vast that learning it consumed a third of a life. They tracked the movements of stars across centuries. They could stop a battle with a single word, and they stood above kings in the social order of their tribes. And yet they wrote nothing down, not a single line. Not one book survives from their own hands. Their temples were made of leaves and air, and their libraries were the memories of living men and women. I have always found something almost unbearably sad about that choice. The Egyptians carved their knowledge into pyramids. The Babylonians pressed it into clay. The Greeks wrote it down and argued about it in the marketplace. But the Druids trusted their voices and their memories, and when the last trained voice was silenced, an entire cosmos went quiet. That silence still echoes. The word itself gives them away. Druid. In the old tongue, it means something close to knowing the oak tree. Think about that for a moment. Their very name binds them to a living thing, not to a distant heaven, not to a book of rules, to a tree. They were priests, yes, but that word is too small for what they actually did. They were judges who could walk between two armies and command the fighting to stop. They were teachers who spent decades training a single student, forcing them to memorize thousands of verses of poetry, law, and genealogy, until the past lived inside their skulls like a second mind. They were astronomers who watched the sky closely enough to build a calendar that held the moon and the sun in step with one another, which is a harder problem than it sounds. They were doctors who knew which plants healed and which ones killed, though almost none of that knowledge survives for us to test. And they were kingmakers. A Celtic chief might hold a sword, but the Druid held the authority to crown him or cast him out. A Druid carried the entire legal system in his head. He was the history book. He was the calendar that told the farmers when to plant. He was the doctor who walked 10 miles through snow to treat a fever. And he was the one person in his tribe who had been taught that death is not an ending. It is only a door that opens into another life. The Romans would later write that the Druids taught their people not to fear death. That made their warriors terrifying in battle. But I think it also made the Druids themselves dangerous to an empire built on obedience and the fear of punishment. To understand the Druids is to understand a civilization that saw the world differently than we do. They did not believe that nature was a resource to be used. They believed it was a conversation to be entered. Every river had a voice. Every hill held a memory. A gust of wind bending the grass was carrying a message for those who knew how to listen. and the oak grove was the place where the human world and the other world leaned closest together. Close enough that a trained mind could hear what was being said on the other side. This was not superstition. At least, it was not superstition in the way we use that word now. It was a worldview as coherent and rigorous as any philosophy produced in Athens. The Druids looked at the oak and saw a map. Its roots reached down into the darkness where the ancestors waited. Its trunk stood in the world of the living, and its branches lifted up into the air where the gods moved. The tree was a diagram of everything that existed, drawn by nothing, standing in a field. And the Druid was the one who had learned to read it. We will never hear their own words. That is the wound that time has left us. Everything we know about the Druids comes from their enemies, their conquerors, or the monks who wrote down old stories centuries after the last Druid had died. It is like trying to reconstruct a symphony from the descriptions of a deaf man. We have fragments, we have echoes, and we have the grove itself, which still stands in 1,000 places across the old Celtic lands, waiting for someone to remember what it meant. Tonight, we are walking into that grove. We will meet the men and women who stood between the human and the divine. We will learn how they learned, how they ruled, and how they were hunted to extinction by an empire that understood exactly what they represented. We will follow their memory into the bogs of Britain and Ireland, across the battlefields of Gaul, and out to the bloodied shores of Anglesey. We will hear the voices of the last Druids through the words of their enemies, and we will try to reconstruct a faith that was deliberately erased from history. And we will ask a question that has never really been answered. Who were the Druids truly? And why, after 2,000 years of silence, do we still feel the need to find them? Our journey begins at the edge of the grove, where the moss grows thickest and the light barely reaches. There is a reason the Druids chose trees over stone. A stone temple stands where you put it. It stays. It dominates the landscape and tells everyone who passes that human hands shaped this place. But a grove grows. It breathes. It sheds its leaves in autumn and grows them back in spring, and in doing so it performs the oldest sermon in the world. The Celts who lived in the shadow of these groves did not see the natural world as a backdrop for human drama. They saw it as the drama itself. A river was not simply water moving downhill. It was a voice. A mountain was not a pile of rock. It was a sleeping giant whose dreams influenced the weather. A forest was not timber waiting to be cut. It was a congregation of elders who had been standing in council since before the first human drew breath. This was animism, though the Celts would never have used that word. To them, it was just reality. Consciousness was not something that stopped at the edge of human skin. It ran through the roots of an oak. It pooled in the water of a spring. It lingered in the mist that rose from a bog on a cold morning. To build a house, to plant a field, to cross a river, was to enter into a negotiation with the spirit of that place. You did not take without asking. You did not cut without explaining yourself. And if you failed to show respect, the consequences were not abstract. Your cattle sickened, your crops withered. Your children woke crying from dreams they could not describe. The world was alive. It was watching, and it had opinions. The Druids were the ones who understood these opinions. They were the translators between the human world and the world that spoke in wind and leaf. And their workplace, their courtroom, their lecture hall, and their sanctuary was the grove. The Celts had a word for such a place. and it has survived in fragments scattered all over the map of Europe. Nemeton. A sanctuary, a sacred clearing, a space defined by what happens inside it rather than by anything anyone built there. But most of the time, the Celts themselves would have simply said, the grove. It was a space made holy not by construction, but by presence. You knew you were in one because the air felt different. The light fell differently through the canopy. The silence was not empty. It was full of attention. Some groves were famous across entire regions. In what is now Turkey, the Galatian Celts maintained a sacred oak grove called nemeton, which meant something like the Temple of the Oak. The word itself tells us everything. It was not a building. It was a tree, and the space around it, and the accumulated centuries of ritual that had soaked into the soil like rain. There is a kind of wisdom in that choice that I did not appreciate until I had sat with it for a while. A cathedral can burn. A temple can be knocked down by an invading army. But a grove is harder to destroy. You can cut the trees, yes, and the Romans would do exactly that. But the roots remain in the ground. The seeds fall and wait. The place remembers what it was, even when the people who named it are gone. The grove is patient in a way that stone is not. The oak stood at the center of this world, not because the Druids worshipped the oak itself, but because the oak was a map. Look at an oak tree in winter. Its roots reach down into the dark earth, deep below what any living eye can see. Its trunk stands solid in the world we walk through every day, and its branches spread upward into the air, into the sky, into the realm of stars and weather and the gods. The oak connected all three levels of reality. Its roots were in the underworld, where the dead waited and the oldest powers slept. Its trunk was the mortal world, the world of cattle and crops and human love and human war. And its branches lifted up into the upper world, the world of sun and moon and the shining ones who moved behind the clouds. The Druid did not need a ladder to travel between worlds. He only needed to understand the oak. This idea was so powerful that it survived even when the Druids themselves were gone. If you travel through Ireland today, you will find the word oak buried in place names like a fossil. Derry comes from the old word for oak grove. Kildare means the church of the oak. Darrow means the plain of the oaks. The Christians who came later built their churches on the same spots where the groves had stood, and they kept the old names, perhaps because the ground itself still hummed with a power they could not explain and did not want to waste. They put stone crosses where oak circles had been, but the geography remembered. The landscape kept the secret. And in these groves, at certain times, the Druids performed a ritual so strange and so beautiful that a Roman writer who only ever heard it described could not get it out of his head and set it down for us to read 2,000 years later. Pliny the Elder was a curious man. He was interested in everything, which is a dangerous habit. He wrote about plants and animals and rocks and the customs of foreign peoples with the same hungry attention. And somewhere in his vast notes, he recorded something he had heard about the Druids of Gaul. He described a ceremony that took place on the 6th day of the new moon. On that day, a group of Druids would gather beneath an oak tree where mistletoe grew. Mistletoe is a strange plant. It does not root in the earth. It grows high in the branches, suspended between the soil and the sky, living on the tree, but not of the tree. Green in winter when everything else has died. To the Druids, this made it holy. It was a plant that lived in two worlds at once. It was the soul of the oak made visible. One Druid would climb the tree, or perhaps stand beneath it, and he would carry a sickle made of gold. That detail has never stopped nagging at me. Gold is a soft metal. It is useless for real cutting. A golden sickle could not have been a practical farming tool. It was a ceremonial object, something that caught the light and signaled that this act was not ordinary harvesting. It was the taking of something sacred. The druid would reach up and cut the mistletoe free, and below him, other druids would hold out a white cloth to catch the falling sprigs. The cloth was important. The mistletoe must not touch the ground. It must remain suspended between earth and sky, even in the moment of its gathering. What happened next, Pliny does not fully describe. But we can guess from what we know of Celtic ritual. The mistletoe would be divided into portions. Some would be given to heal the sick, some would be kept for the great festivals. Some might be burned as an offering, and the act itself would be accompanied by prayers so old that even the druids who spoke them did not know who had composed them first. The words had simply been passed from teacher to student for so many generations that their origin had dissolved into the past like salt in water. This ritual was not magic in the way a modern fantasy novel might describe magic. It was not about waving a wand and changing the rules of reality. It was about precision. It was about doing the right thing at the right time in the right place with the right words. The Druids believed that the universe was ordered, but that the order was delicate. It could be maintained by careful attention, or it could be broken by carelessness. The mistletoe ceremony was maintenance. It was the oiling of a hinge. It was the act of saying to the world, we remember how things are supposed to be, and we are still paying attention. The mistletoe itself embodied the Druidic understanding of life and death. In winter, when the oak stood bare and seemed dead, the mistletoe remained green. It was the life that persisted when everything else appeared to have failed. It was the promise that the green world would return. And because it grew without touching the earth, it was also a bridge. It connected the upper and lower realms through the body of the tree. When a druid cut it, he was not simply gathering medicine. He was harvesting a piece of the cosmic order. But the grove was more than a place for ritual. It was a doorway. The Celts believed that the world we see is not the only world. Just beyond the edge of ordinary perception, existing in the same space but on a different frequency, was another realm. Some call it the other world. Some call it the land of the ever young. It was not heaven in the Christian sense, and it was not hell. It was a parallel dimension, a mirror of our own world, but more beautiful, more vivid, and strangely more real. Time moved differently there. Sickness did not exist. The dead walked among the living, and the living could stumble into the other world by accident if they were not careful. The veil between these two worlds was thin in certain places. A fairy mound, one of those ancient earthworks built by a people even older than the Celts, might be a door. A spring bubbling up from the ground might be a passage, because water flows between worlds as easily as it flows between valleys. And a grove, especially an oak grove, was one of the thinnest places of all. The Druids did not create these doorways. They discovered them. They learned which trees stood at the center of a crossing, which stones marked a boundary, which pools reflected not just the sky, but something looking back from behind it. I find this worldview both terrifying and comforting. Terrifying because it means the world is crowded with intelligences we cannot see and do not understand. Comforting because it means we are not alone in a dead machine of a universe. The Druids lived in a world that was awake. Every hill was a sleeping giant. Every river was a goddess with moods and preferences. And the grove was the place where a human being could sit down and listen to what the world had to say. The Druid was not a master of this relationship. He was a mediator. He did not command the spirits. He negotiated with them. He learned their etiquette, their taboos, their favorite offerings. He knew which spring required a gift of silver, which tree must never be cut, which direction the wind must be addressed before a journey could begin. This knowledge was not written in any book. It was carried in the mind, tested by experience, and corrected by the consequences of getting it wrong. A druid who misread the signs might bring blight to his tribe. A druid who performed the wrong ritual at the wrong time might open a door that should have stayed closed. And so the grove was a place of tremendous responsibility. It was beautiful, yes. The light filtering through oak leaves in summer is one of the most peaceful sights I can imagine. But it was also dangerous. The same doorway that allowed blessings to flow into the human world could also let things through from the other side. The druid stood at that threshold, holding it open or holding it shut, depending on what the community needed. He was a janitor of the cosmic order, a diplomat to the invisible, and a doctor for a world that was made of spirit as much as it was made of matter. The Celts did not need to be told that nature was sacred. They felt it in their bones. The Druids were simply the ones who had spent enough time listening to translate what they heard into advice that could keep a tribe alive through a hard winter. They knew when to plant because they had watched the stars and listened to the soil. They knew when to fight because they had read the flight of birds and felt the mood of the land. And they knew when to hold a festival because they could feel the veil thinning, the old year dying, the new year pressing against it like a child against a membrane, ready to be born. This was the world the Druids moved through. A world of doors in the landscape, of voices in the wind, of green life that refused to die even in the darkest months. And at the center of it all stood the oak, patient and ancient, its roots drinking from the underworld while its branches brushed the sky. The druid stood beneath it, golden sickle in hand, and tried to keep the conversation going between the human and the divine. But a conversation requires two voices, and the druid had to learn to speak before he could ever hope to listen. You did not become a druid by walking into a grove and declaring yourself one. The path was longer than most people lived. If a boy or girl showed the right signs, the right kind of memory, the right stillness of mind, they might be taken from their family young. I cannot tell you how young, because no ancient source gives a number, and anyone who hands you one is guessing and hoping you will not ask. What the sources do give us is the length of the thing, and that is startling enough without inventing anything. They watched. They listened. They noticed which children could sit in silence without fidgeting, which ones remembered a story after hearing it only once, which ones seemed to hear things in the wind that other children missed. Those were the ones they took. And then the training began, and it ran on a scale we have no modern equivalent for, something on the order of 20 years. That number comes down to us from a single Roman sentence, and we will come back shortly to how much weight it can actually carry, but take it at face value for a moment. 20 years is longer than it takes to become a doctor, a lawyer, and a priest combined. It is nearly a third of a human life in the ancient world. The student would live with their teacher, often in the forest, sometimes in a settlement, but always at the edge of it, always half in the human world and half in the other. They learn to read the sky first, then the trees, then the patterns of animal behavior, then the human heart. And only after all of that, if they proved worthy, did they learn the law and the theology that made a druid what he was. The Romans were astonished by this system. Julius Caesar is where the number comes from, and I want to be accurate about what he actually wrote, because it has hardened in the retelling into something firmer than his own sentence. He did not say that every Druid served a fixed term of 20 years. He said that some of them were still in training after 20 years had passed. Whether that was the standard course or the outer edge of it, nobody alive can tell us. But Caesar was a man who understood power, and even at the loose end of his own wording, he recognized that the Druids had built something Rome had never managed. A university that required no buildings, no scrolls, no endowments. Only a voice and a memory sharp enough to hold the accumulated knowledge of centuries. The Greek and Roman writers tell us the students were divided into 3 orders: the bard, the ovate, and the druid proper. I want to flag something about that list now, because it matters later, and because it is the first thing that gets flattened in the retelling. Those writers were outsiders. They were describing a system nobody had trained them in, from the outside, in their own vocabulary. And it is entirely possible they took 3 kinds of work and stacked them into a neat ladder that was never a ladder at all. What we can say is that the 3 words existed, that they described genuinely different jobs, and that a man who reached the top of the scale ranked alongside a petty king. The bard was the memory of the tribe. That sounds poetic, and it is. But it was also practical in a way that is hard for us to understand. We write things down. We have libraries and databases and search engines. If I want to know who my great-grandfather was, I can look it up or ask a relative who kept records. But in a world without writing, memory is everything. A tribe that forgets its genealogy forgets who it is. A king who cannot prove his lineage back 7 generations is not a king at all. He is just a man with a sword and a big house. The bard held all of this in his head. He knew every marriage, every feud, every battle, every cattle raid, every death by drowning or spear or sickness going back centuries. He could recite the lineage of a king for 20 generations without pausing. And he could do it in verse, set to meter, because the human mind remembers poetry better than prose. This was not art for art's sake. It was a filing system. The rhythm and the rhyme were hooks that kept the facts from slipping away. But the bard was not a passive recorder. He was a weapon. This is the part of the job that frightens me, in a way that makes me respect them and fear them at the same time. A bard could compose a satire so sharp that it could ruin a man. In the Irish tradition, this was called the glam deacon, and it was not a joke. It was a formal ritual of destruction. The bard would stand before the target and compose a poem that mocked his lineage, his appearance, his courage, and his honor. If the satire was just, if the bard spoke truth, the victim would break out in boils. His face would redden. His cattle would sicken. He would become a laughingstock. And in a society where reputation was the only currency that mattered, this was a death sentence worse than a spear through the chest. Kings kept bards close, not because they enjoyed poetry, but because they feared it. A generous king who treated his poets well would have his deeds sung for centuries. A stingy or cruel king would have his name turned into a curse that outlived his grandchildren. The bard was the press, the historian, and the assassin all at once, and he needed no poison, only words. The training of a bard took at least 7 years, sometimes 12. The student learned hundreds of tales, thousands of verses, and the complex metrical rules that governed different kinds of composition. They learned to play the harp or the lyre, because music was another hook for memory. And they learned to improvise, because no two performances were ever the same. A bard at a feast might be asked to sing the deeds of a king's grandfather, and he would have to adapt the old poem to include references to the current political situation, to praise the right allies and subtly warn the right enemies. It was a performance art and a survival skill, and the best bards were as feared as any champion with a sword. Then there was the ovate. That word is a small curiosity in itself and worth 30 seconds of your time. The Latin writers called this man ovates, which is simply their word for a seer. Strabo, writing in Greek, gives something close to the same sound. The English word ovate arrives far later than either of them. It shows up in print for the first time in 1723, in a book by a Welsh clergyman named Henry Rowlands, who was trying to prove that the old stones of Anglesey had been Druid temples. Hold on to that island. We will be back there before the night is out, and the second visit is a great deal worse than the first. So the middle grade of modern Druidry is named with a word no ancient Druid ever heard spoken. The job underneath the word, though, is old. The ovate was the seer, the sacrificer, the one who walked closest to the boundary between the living and the dead. If the bard was the memory of the tribe, the ovate was its eyes in the dark. The ovate learned to read signs, not symbols in a book, signs in the world, the flight of birds across the sky, especially the raven and the crow, the entrails of a sacrificed animal, which could reveal the mood of the gods if you knew how to look, the patterns of smoke from a fire, the way mist moved across a valley at dawn, the sound of water in a sacred spring. These were not random events to an ovate. They were a language, and he was learning to read it the way a modern child learns to read letters. I have sometimes wondered what it must have felt like to believe so completely in the world's ability to speak. We check our weather apps and call it prediction. They watched the behavior of foxes and the color of the sunset and called it the same thing. The difference is that they thought the world was trying to tell them something specific. A flock of birds flying left instead of right was not a meteorological phenomenon. It was advice, warning, or approval. The ovate also presided over sacrifice. This is the part that makes modern people uncomfortable, and I understand why. But we need to be clear about what sacrifice meant in this context, because the Romans who described it were not neutral observers. To the Druids, sacrifice was a transaction. The gods or the spirits of the land gave the tribe rain, fertility, victory, and health. The tribe gave back something of value to maintain the balance. It was not murder, it was payment. And the ovate was the accountant who made sure the books stayed balanced. The sacrifice could be an animal, and usually it was. A bull, a pig, a sheep. The animal was treated with respect, killed quickly, and its meat was shared among the community. The hide might be preserved. The bones might be offered to the fire or cast into a sacred pool. Nothing was wasted. But there are also accounts, particularly from Caesar, that suggest human sacrifice was practiced in Gaul under certain circumstances. Criminals were the usual victims, men who had already forfeited their place in society by breaking its most serious laws. Their deaths served two purposes. They removed a threat from the tribe, and they gave the gods a gift of sufficient value to avert a greater disaster, like famine or plague. I am not going to sanitize this. It was killing, and killing is ugly. But I will say that the Romans who wrote about it with such horror were not strangers to public execution, gladiatorial combat, or the mass crucifixion of rebels. They saw the Druidic sacrifice as barbaric because it was done for religious reasons rather than political ones, and because it threatened the Roman idea that the state alone held the power of life and death. The hypocrisy is thick enough to choke on. And then there was the Druid proper. This was the rank that took the full training to reach, and not every student made it. Many spent their lives as bards or ovates, and there was no shame in that. The Druid was something else entirely. He was the judge, the philosopher, the astronomer, the doctor, and the theologian. He was the finished product of a system designed to produce not specialists but generalists of terrifying breadth. The Druid knew the law, all of it. Every contract, every property dispute, every marriage arrangement, every blood price for every kind of injury from a slap to a killing. Celtic law was not simple. It had as many nuances as Roman law, perhaps more, because it had to account for a society where kinship and honor were the foundations of everything. And the Druid carried it all in his head. He could walk into a village where two families had been feuding for 3 generations, listen to both sides, and render a judgment that everyone would accept. Not because he had an army to enforce it, but because his authority was absolute. To refuse a Druid's judgment was to place yourself outside the protection of the gods and the tribe. This authority was so complete that a Druid could step between 2 armies on the verge of battle and command them to stop. And they would stop. Not always, but often enough that the Romans noted it with something like disbelief. In a world where warriors measured themselves by their willingness to fight, the Druid was the one man they would not challenge. To kill a Druid was to bring a curse on your entire lineage. It was to pollute the earth itself. It was unthinkable. The Druid also had the power of excommunication. He could ban a person from attending the sacrifices, from receiving the protection of the tribe, from the communal fire. This was not a spiritual punishment in the abstract sense. It was social death. A man who could not attend the festivals, who could not swear oaths before the community, who could not receive the blessing of the grove, was no longer truly a member of his own people. He became a ghost while still alive. And this power made the Druid the ultimate enforcer of social order. He did not need prisons. He needed only words. But the Druid was more than a judge. He was a scientist, or at least what passed for one in the ancient world. He tracked the movements of the stars. He understood the cycle of the moon well enough to work at a problem that has embarrassed a great many civilizations, which is how to make lunar months and a solar year agree with one another when they stubbornly refuse to divide. We have one object that shows this work being done. The collinear calendar, found in France in the late 19th century, is a bronze tablet laid out in the Gaulish language using Latin letters and Roman numerals. It maps a 5-year cycle with extra months slotted in to drag the moon back into step with the sun. It marks days as favorable or unfavorable. It marks the festivals. It is the best evidence we have that somebody in the Celtic world was doing serious calendar mathematics rather than simply watching the sky and hoping. And the Druid was a doctor. He knew which plants could stop bleeding, which could bring down a fever, which could ease the pain of childbirth, and which could kill a man if given in the wrong dose. He could set bones and treat wounds, and possibly a good deal more than that. I want to be careful about how far I push this, because there is a version of the story where the Druids were secretly better physicians than Rome, and I cannot find a Roman who says so. What I can find is Pliny, writing down a handful of their remedies in the tone of a man recording a rumor he fully intends to laugh at. Mistletoe steeped in drink for infertility. A herb called clergyman gathered without iron, carried in a white cloth. The striking thing is not that Pliny believed any of it. It is that a Roman naturalist thought Druidic medicine was worth the ink at all, and then could not resist sneering at it on the way past. Everything else is gone. It was practical knowledge, tested over centuries, passed from teacher to student without ever being written in a book. And when the last Druid died, whole libraries of pharmacology died with him. We cannot even take the measure of the loss, because we have nothing left to measure it against. The most famous doctrine of the Druids, the one that Caesar found most remarkable, was their teaching on death. They believed that the soul does not die. It passes into another body after a period of rest. Some said the soul moved from human to human. Some said it could move between humans and animals. The details probably varied from tribe to tribe and from teacher to teacher. But the core belief was clear. Death is not an ending. It is a change of address. This belief had consequences. It meant that a warrior could face battle without fear, because the worst that could happen to him was a temporary inconvenience. It meant that the Druids themselves could face torture and execution with a calm that unnerved their enemies. And it meant that the dead were not truly gone. They were simply waiting in the other world or in the next life, and they still had an interest in the affairs of the living. The Druid was the one who understood this economy of souls. He knew how to honor the dead so that they would bless the living. He knew how to read the signs that the dead sent back through dreams and omens. That, I suspect, is why the Romans feared them so deeply. It was not just their legal authority or their medical knowledge, or their ability to rally tribes against invasion. It was their calm. A man who does not fear death is a man who cannot be controlled by threats. And the Druids taught entire tribes to stop fearing it. The training that produced this kind of person was not gentle. Students were expected to memorize vast amounts of material without writing any of it down. They learned in the dark, literally. Some accounts suggest that advanced students were made to study by night and sleep by day, to sharpen their ability to think clearly in darkness and silence. They fasted. They spent long periods alone in the forest. They were tested with riddles, with impossible questions, with sudden demands to recite a genealogy backward or compose a satire on the spot. The ones who broke under the pressure were sent back to their families, no shame attached, but no rank either. The ones who survived emerged as something that was neither fully human nor fully divine, but a bridge between the two. And when a student finally reached the end of that long road, when the teacher looked at him and saw that he had become what he was meant to become, there was no diploma, no ceremony that we would recognize. Only the acknowledgement that he could now speak with the authority of all the teachers who had come before him, going back through the generations to a time before memory. He could enter the grove alone. He could judge a king. He could look at the sky and know what the stars meant. He could stand at the threshold between the worlds and hold it open, or shut it as the tribe required. He was a Druid, and the world had better pay attention. History remembers the powerful, but it worships the remembered. And the Druids understood this better than anyone. They trained their bards to sing the deeds of kings, because they knew that a man who is forgotten is a man who never lived at all. But the irony is that the Druids themselves, the ones who preserved everyone else's memory, left almost no record of their own individual lives. We do not know the names of the teachers who spent their whole lives in the groves. We do not know the faces of the judges who stopped battles. They were trained to be invisible, to be voices rather than persons, channels for a tradition that was older than any single life. But here and there, in the old Irish sagas and the fragments of Roman correspondence, a few names have survived. Not many. Just enough to remind us that these were not abstract figures in white robes. They were men with ambitions and fears and complicated relationships with the kings they served. They made mistakes. They had rivals. They died badly, some of them, and others lived long enough to see everything they built crumble into dust. These are the ones we can almost see as human beings, and I want to introduce you to 3 of them now. They are not the whole story. They are just the few faces that history has not quite managed to erase. Before I do, one thing about the shape of that list. All 3 of them are men, and I am not going to slide past that as though it were the natural order of things. The Irish material knows perfectly well that women did this work. It has a word for them. The Bandri, the woman Druid, appears in the sagas as a teacher, a prophet, and a worker of enchantments, and there are women on the continent described doing much the same job under other names. Not one of them survives as a person we can follow. They reach us as a role, as a line in a lore tract, as a figure standing at the edge of somebody else's story. So the 3 faces I can show you are the 3 faces the record happened to keep, and the record was kept by men who were writing about other men. Hold that in mind while I introduce them. The first is Cathbad. He was the chief druid of King Cynulfa, Mark Nessa at Evin Marca, the royal seat of Ulster in the north of Ireland. The stories say that he was old when Cynulfa was young, and that he had already been old for a long time. He had the kind of authority that does not need to raise its voice. When Cathbad entered the hall, the warriors stopped boasting. The king himself waited to speak until the druid had taken his seat. This was not courtesy. It was law. At Evin Marca, no man was permitted to speak before the king had spoken, and the king was not permitted to speak before his druids had spoken. Follow that rule to the end of the line, and you arrive somewhere strange. In a hall full of armed men who answered to Cynulfa, Cynulfa answered to Cathbad. That is a stranger arrangement than it first appears. In most ancient societies, the priest served the king, or the king served as his own priest. But in Ulster, the power flowed both ways. Cynulfa ruled the territory and led the warriors. Cathbad ruled the meaning of things. He decided when the seasons had truly turned. He interpreted the dreams that came to the king in the night. And when a child was born, or sometimes before it was born, it was Cathbad who looked at the stars and the smoke and the flight of birds and announced what that child would become. The most famous story about him begins with a feast. The men of Ulster were gathered in the house of Fedlimid, the king's own storyteller, drinking the strong ale that was the pride of the province, and Cathbad was there in his place of honor. Fedlimid's wife was heavily pregnant. She was moving between the tables with a jug, filling cups, doing the ordinary work of a host, and as she passed the drinking men, the child inside her screamed. Not cried, screamed. Loud enough to carry the length of the hall. Loud enough that the warriors went for their weapons the way men do when they have been frightened by something they cannot put a name to. The hall emptied of noise, and into that silence they brought the woman to Cathbad. He put his hand flat against her belly. He listened to whatever it is that a druid listens to. And then he told the room what was coming. The child was a girl. She would have yellow hair and long eyes and skin like snow, and she would be the most beautiful woman ever born in Ireland. And because of her, kings would go to war. The greatest warriors of Ulster would be driven into exile. Blood would soak the province, and the province would never entirely recover from it. He gave the child a name before she had drawn a breath. Deirdre, he called her, after the sound of that scream. The Ulstermen wanted the baby killed where she lay. Kill her now, they said, tonight, before any of this can begin. And Conovar, who had just been told at length how beautiful this child was going to be, refused. He would keep her. He had the infant taken from her family and raised in isolation, in a house away from the world, under the eye of a nurse, so that when she came of age, she would be his and nobody else's. And if you know anything at all about Irish myth, you know how well that arrangement held. The beauty, the glimpse of a young warrior, the elopement to Scotland, the false promise of safe conduct home, the slaughter of the sons of Ishlu, the exile of Fergus, the long war that followed. But I want to stay with Cathbad for a moment, because the story is not really about Deirdre. It is about what it meant to be a druid who could speak the future into being. Cathbad did not curse the child. He simply described what he saw. And look at what the description did. Conovar locked her away because of the prophecy. The locking away is precisely what made her reach for the first young man she ever laid eyes on. Reaching for him is what burned Ulster. The prophecy did not predict the disaster from a safe distance. The prophecy was the first domino. That is a terrifying kind of power, and I'm not sure Cathbad fully understood that he had it. To name something is to summon it. To see the future is to make it compulsory. The sagas also say that Cathbad was Conovar's father, though the circumstances are murky and vary from one telling to another. In some versions, the druid sleeps with the king's mother through trickery or magic. In others, it is a more straightforward affair. Either way, the bloodline of Ulster's greatest king ran through a druid, and that tells us something important about how these men were seen. They were not just advisors, they were ancestors. They were the source of royal legitimacy. A king who had no druid in his lineage was a king whose right to rule could be questioned. Cathbad turns up elsewhere in the cycle, doing things that surprise people who picture druids as harmless old men in white robes. He is the one who announces, on a particular morning, that any boy who takes up arms on that day will have his name sung forever, and will not live to hear much of it. A child called Shaitan too overhears him. The child takes up arms that afternoon and becomes Cuchulainn, and every word of it comes true on schedule. Cathbad had not been talking to him. Cathbad had simply been saying what the day was, out loud, within earshot of the wrong 7-year-old. And he is the one who, at the end of the Deirdre affair, when Conovar has broken a guarantee that Cathbad himself stood behind, turns on his own king and curses Evin Marca, the royal seat of Ulster, the place he had served his whole life. He is a man who contains contradictions. He is a prophet and a politician. He is a father and a figure of terror. He is the voice of tradition, and yet he is capable of acts that bend or break the rules he is supposed to uphold. Some scholars have suggested that Cathbad is the original template for Merlin. I am not sure I buy that completely, but I see the resemblance. The wise old man behind the throne. The prophet who is also the king's father in a hidden way. The magician who serves the state but is not quite part of it. The figure who knows the future and is powerless to stop it. If Cathbad is not Merlin's direct ancestor, he is at least a cousin. They share the same job description. They stand in the same drafty hall, watching the young king make the mistakes that the old man already knows will destroy him. And then there is Amergin. He is a different kind of druid entirely. Amergin appears in the Book of Invasions, the medieval text that tries to make sense of how Ireland came to be inhabited by the people who called themselves the Gaels. The story goes that a great fleet sailed from Spain, led by the sons of Miel, a warrior and explorer whose people were destined to take the island from its old gods. And Amergin was their druid, their poet, and their judge. He was the triply trained sage, the man who had mastered all three kinds of work, and he was the reason the invasion succeeded. Because the old gods of Ireland, the divine tribe who had ruled the island since before memory, were not going to give it up without a fight. They were powerful. They were beautiful. They controlled the weather, the crops, the very fertility of the land. And when the Mylichans came ashore and marched inland to the royal hill, the three kings of that divine tribe did something nobody expected. They did not attack. They asked for a ruling. They said they had been caught unready, that a landing taken by surprise was no honest contest at all, and they asked the invaders to appoint a judge. The invaders appointed Amergin, their own man, their own brother. And this is the moment I keep coming back to, because Amergin did not rule for his own side. He ruled that the Mylish Huns must return to their ships, put out from the shore and withdraw beyond the ninth wave, past the boundary of the land's own protection. Only then, if they could come in again through open water, would Ireland honestly be theirs. It was a judgment against his own family, delivered in front of the enemy, and his own family obeyed it without argument. That is what a trained man's judgment meant. It did not matter whose brother he was. So they went. And the moment the fleet crossed that ninth wave, the old gods showed them exactly what the ruling had cost. They raised a storm. The wind screamed. The waves stood up like walls. The fleet was scattered, and the sons of Miel found themselves driven out into open water, helpless against a power older and stranger than anything they had faced. Amergin stood on the deck of his ship, and he understood that this was not a battle that could be won with swords. The old gods had claimed the land by right of poetry. They had sung it into being, or they had sung themselves into it, and the land recognized their voice. If the Mylichans were going to take Ireland, they would have to claim it with a stronger song. So Amergin sang. What he sang over that water was an invocation. He called on the land of Ireland by name. He called on its mountains and its rivers, on its fish-filled waters and its wooded valleys, and he asked the island itself to receive the people standing off its coast. He was not shouting at the weather. He was addressing the thing behind the weather in the only register it recognized, and he was asking it for permission. And the storm stopped. The wind fell. The waves lay down. The ships came to shore. Then, Amergin put his right foot on Irish soil, and he spoke a second time. And it is this second poem that people mean when they say the Song of Amergin. I want to keep the two of them apart, because almost every retelling folds them into one, and I have folded them into one myself in the past. The first poem summoned a place. The second one does something far stranger. Line after line, the poet refuses to describe the world. He claims to be it. He is the wind moving over the sea. He is the wave under the wind. He is the bull of 7 battles, and the hawk on the cliff face, and the salmon lying still in the pool. He is the point of the spear. He is the hill where poems are made. And in the last and strangest line of all, he is the god who kindles the fire inside a man's head. I'm giving you the sense of it rather than a fixed set of words, and I want to tell you why. Every English version of this poem you will ever encounter is a translator's reconstruction from difficult and damaged Irish, and they disagree with each other about nearly every line. Some of the most famous phrasings people quote as ancient were written in the 20th century by poets who had their own reasons for wanting the poem to say what it says. It is a strange poem. It is a claim of identity with everything. Imogen is not asking the land to accept him. He is announcing that he already is the land, and the sea, and the sky, and the fire. He is claiming Ireland not by conquest, but by metaphysics. He is saying that the same force that moves through the old gods also moves through him, and that there is no contradiction in his presence here. And that is the story. A poet turned back an army of gods with nothing but his voice, and then stepped ashore and told the island what he was. It is one of the most powerful moments in all of Celtic myth, and it reveals something essential about what the Druids thought they were doing when they spoke. Words were not decoration, they were action. A true poem, spoken by a true poet, was a force that could reshape reality. It could part the sea. It could still a storm. It could make the land itself accept a new master. But Imogen was not only a magician. He was a lawyer in the oldest sense of that word, and we have already watched what that meant when he sent his own brothers back out past the 9th wave rather than hand them an easy win. The tradition gives him one more settlement, and I have to be honest that this one reaches us in pieces. It is told differently in different sources. Sometimes the credit goes to Imogen, sometimes to one of the old gods dividing up the country afterward, and the medieval compilers were clearly stitching together material that did not originally belong to one another. So I'm going to give you the shape of it rather than pretend it is a single clean scene on a beach, because it is not. What the tradition agrees on is the outcome. Ireland was divided, and it was not divided along any line you could walk. The Milesians took the surface, the old gods went down, into the hills, into the fairy mounds, into the hollow places beneath the earth. They became the hidden people, the ones who lived just beyond the edge of human sight, powerful but unseen. What is fascinating about that settlement is how unsatisfying it is. Nobody gets everything. The old gods lose their visible kingdom. The Milesians gain a land that is still half owned by someone else. It is a partition, a divorce settlement, a treaty written in smoke. And yet, it lasted. The old gods became the fairies, the good people, the neighbors who lived in the mounds, and the Milesians became the Irish. And the boundary between the two worlds, the visible and the hidden, became the central fact of Irish folklore and has stayed that way for 1,000 years and more. All because somebody, somewhere in the long telling of it, decided that the best ending was not victory, but division. Imogen's end was not glorious. The stories say that he was killed within a few years of the landing, struck down by one of his own brothers after the sons of Meal fell out over how to carve up the island they had only just won. The man who had judged fairly between gods and invaders died in a family argument about property. It is a strangely petty death for a man who talked a storm into lying down. But maybe that is the point. The Druids were not immortal. They were not even particularly safe. They lived in a world where a spear could end any song and where brothers killed brothers over cattle and pride. The magic was real, but it was not stronger than iron. And then there is the third face, Divisaicus. He is different from Cathbad and Imogen in a way that matters more than anything else I am going to tell you in this section. Cathbad and Imogen reach us through story. Divi Secus does not. Divisaicus is the only druid in the whole of antiquity whose existence is attested by name in a contemporary source. Sit with the size of that. An order that ran for centuries across half a continent, that trained men for 20 years at a stretch, that judged kings and stopped wars, and we have one name we can be reasonably confident belonged to a breathing human being. 1. He was not a king, incidentally, though you will find him called one in plenty of places. The Idui, a powerful tribe in what is now eastern France, had done away with kingship altogether. They elected a chief magistrate for a single year at a time, and Caesar, reaching for a word his Roman readers would recognize, simply calls Diviciacus a senator of his people. He was an aristocrat, a magistrate, a diplomat, and by Cicero's account, a druid. Because Cicero is how we know. The two men met. When Diviciacus came to Rome, he stayed under Cicero's roof as a guest, and years afterward, writing a book about divination. Cicero remembered those conversations and set them down. He wrote that the Gaul understood natural philosophy, that he knew something of the workings of the heavens, and that he claimed to read what was coming by augury. Think about that for a moment. The greatest orator in Rome, a man who considered himself the peak of civilized intellect, sat down with a Celtic Druid and listened to him explain how he read the future. And he took it seriously enough to write it down. Diviciacus also runs all through Caesar's writings, and here is a curiosity that I cannot let go of. Caesar knew this man well. He praises him repeatedly. He describes his authority, leans on his intelligence about Gallic politics, and at one point spares his brother's life for no reason other than not wanting to offend him. And Caesar never once calls him a druid. The man who wrote our single longest surviving description of the Druidic order somehow never mentions that his most useful ally in Gaul was a member of it. Make of that what you like. I take it as a small, sobering reminder of how thin the ground under all of this actually is. And Diviciacus made a choice that Amigen never had to make. He decided to ally himself with Rome. He traveled to Rome. He stood in front of the Senate and asked for help. His people had been broken in battle by the Sequinia and the Averni, rival Gaulish tribes who had done something the Idui considered close to unforgivable. They had hired Germans. A Suebian war leader named Ariovistus had come over the Rhine at their invitation, and when the fighting was finished, he had declined to go home. He had taken a third of the territory belonging to the very tribe that invited him. He was holding hostages. The Idui were paying tribute, and their nobles had sworn oaths of submission. Diviciacus had refused to swear. He would not hand over his own children as security. And so he crossed a continent to ask a foreign senate for soldiers, trading independence for protection. And from his perspective, it probably made sense. The Romans had discipline, organization, and resources that no Celtic tribe could match. If you could not beat them, perhaps you could join them and preserve something of your people. But the tragedy of Diviciacus is that he was trying to make a deal with a machine that had no interest in partnership. Caesar used him. He used the alliance with the Idui to justify his interventions in Gaul. He used Diviciacus's respectability to present himself as a liberator rather than a conqueror. And while Diviciacus was in Rome making speeches, Caesar's legions were marching through the Gallic countryside, mapping the roads, noting the strongholds, preparing the ground for total subjugation. I do not know what Diviciacus thought when he realized what was happening. The records do not tell us. But I imagine it was a slow, sickening understanding, the kind that comes to you in pieces over months and years. The Romans were not going to protect Gaul. They were going to eat it. And the Druid who had tried to save his people by embracing the empire had instead handed them to it on a silver plate. Device Saicus disappears from history after a certain point. We do not know how he died. We do not know if he lived long enough to see his tribe crushed, his groves cut down, his students killed or enslaved. But I think of him sometimes when I read about other leaders who have made the same bargain, who have looked at an overwhelming power and decided that the only way to survive is to become useful to it. There is a particular kind of grief reserved for the collaborator who realizes too late that the partner was never going to share. These three men, Cathbad and Emersion and Divashicus, are the closest we can come to knowing individual druids, and notice how uneven the ground is beneath them. Two of them reach us through tales that Christian monks wrote down 1,000 years after the fact, reshaped for an audience that no longer believed a word of the theology. One reaches us through the books of the empire that destroyed his world. There is no third category. There is no druid anywhere who speaks to us in his own voice, about his own life, in his own language. They are not typical either. They are the ones exceptional enough to be remembered, which means they were probably exceptional in life as well. But they show us the range of what a druid could be. The prophet who speaks the future and cannot stop it. The poet who claims the land with a song and then dies in a family squabble. The politician who tries to ride the tiger of empire and is consumed by it. They were priests, yes. They were judges and doctors and astronomers. But they were also men who stood in drafty halls and worried about their kings. They were men who made bad deals and good poems and terrible mistakes. And when the last of them was gone, when the last voice that could recite the Song of Amigin fell silent, the grove was still there. The oak was still standing. But there was no one left who knew how to listen to what it was saying. The Romans were coming, and they had already decided that a world full of listening trees was a world that needed to be cut down. The legions came not as tourists, but as engineers of forgetting. They built roads that cut through sacred groves, as if the trees were no different from any other obstacle. They erected bridges over rivers without asking permission. They burned villages and counted heads and wrote reports back to Rome about the customs of the people they had defeated. And among all the things they wrote, one name appears again and again with a frequency that suggests something more than casual interest. The Druids. The Romans were obsessed with them. Julius Caesar is our most detailed source, and that is a problem. He was not a neutral observer. He was a general who had spent 8 years conquering Gaul, and he needed to justify the blood and the gold and the political capital he had spent doing it. His book, The Gallic Wars, was written for a Roman Senate that was already nervous about his ambitions. It needed to portray the Gauls as dangerous enough to require conquest, but not so civilized that the conquest was unjust. And the Druids were the perfect symbol for this balancing act. They were learned enough to impress a Roman audience, but strange enough to seem foreign. They had power, which made them a threat, but they lacked writing, which made them primitive. Caesar described the Druids with a mixture of respect and condescension that tells you a good deal about him. He admits that their system of education is impressive. Years of memorization stacked on years. A curriculum that includes astronomy, natural philosophy, and theology. He notes that they teach the doctrine of reincarnation, and he seems genuinely struck by the idea that this belief makes their warriors fearless in battle. A man who does not fear death cannot be threatened, and a tribe that cannot be threatened cannot be ruled. But then Caesar moves to the part that his Roman readers were waiting for. He describes human sacrifice. He writes of criminals being burned alive inside giant figures made of wicker, effigies shaped like men and stuffed with living victims and set ablaze. He mentions the sacrifice of animals, which would have seemed normal enough to Romans, but he lingers on the human victims. He gives numbers, or at least he implies them. Multitudes, countless victims, a religion soaked in blood, and other writers piled in on top of him. Strabo, working from an older Greek source, describes a seer stabbing a victim in the back and reading the future in the way the dying body fell. That detail gets attributed to Caesar constantly, including by people who should know better. And it is worth keeping the two of them separate, because Strabo never went to Gaul and Caesar did. I have to be even-handed here, because my own reading is that Caesar is telling the truth about some things and lying about others, or at least exaggerating in ways that serve his purpose. Human sacrifice was practiced in the ancient world by many peoples, including the Romans themselves. The Roman state had only recently, within living memory, banned the practice of burying people alive as offerings to the gods. The gladiatorial games, which Romans considered light entertainment, had started life as funeral rites, blood spilled to honor the dead, and had simply been rebranded as spectacles somewhere along the way. Prisoners of war and criminals were killed in public to appease the divine powers and to demonstrate the strength of the state. So when Caesar expresses horror at Celtic sacrifice, he is standing on very thin moral ground. But I do not think he invented it entirely. Archaeology has given us too many bodies that tell the same story. The bog bodies of northern Europe, preserved by the acidic water and the cold, show signs of ritual killing. Lindoman, whom we will meet properly later on, appears to have been struck on the head, to have had a cord drawn tight around his neck, and to have taken a wound to the throat, all inside a very short space of time, before going into a bog. The triple death, as some people call it, matches deaths described in Irish myth. I will have more to say later about how solid that reading actually is, because it is less solid than you have probably been told. And the Colligny calendar, held with all the caution I asked you to hold it with earlier, still shows us a Gaulish religious culture organized enough to schedule its observances to the day. So I believe the Druids did kill people, sometimes under certain circumstances. What I do not believe is Caesar's implication that this was the defining feature of their religion, or that it made them more barbaric than the civilization that was about to crucify thousands of rebels along the Appian Way. The real reason Caesar feared the Druids was not their religion. It was their law. He understood something that many modern historians miss. The Druids were the memory of the tribes. They held the legal system in their hands. They could recite the precedents for every dispute going back centuries. They knew the boundaries of every territory, the terms of every alliance, the blood prices for every injury. And memory is power. A people who remember who they are cannot be absorbed easily into an empire. They resist. They negotiate. They demand terms. The Romans were brilliant at incorporating conquered peoples, but they needed those peoples to forget who they had been first. You cannot Romanize a man who still knows the old songs. And so, the conquest of Gaul was not just a military campaign. It was a war against memory. The Romans targeted the Druids deliberately. They burned the groves, not because they hated trees, but because they understood that the grove was a library. Every tree was a shelf. Every ritual was a page. When the grove burned, the book burned with it. And when the Druid died, the library died with him. It was carried out with the same methodical thoroughness the Romans brought to road building and drainage and everything else they touched, and it worked. The suppression began in earnest under the Emperor Tiberius, who reigned in the early 1st century, though Augustus had already made a start before him by forbidding Roman citizens to have anything to do with the practice. Tiberius issued an edict banning Druidic practices throughout the Roman territories in Gaul. 2 emperors later, Claudius went further still, outlawing the religion entirely and actively hunting down its practitioners. The groves were cut down. The golden sickles were melted or buried. The students who had spent 5 years or 10 years in training found themselves suddenly without teachers, without sanctuaries, without the social structure that made their existence possible. Some probably went underground, practicing in secret, passing fragments of knowledge to a few trusted initiates in darkened rooms. Others were killed. Still others simply stopped. The chain of transmission broken, a lifetime of training reduced to a few whispered remedies and half-remembered songs. But Gaul was not the end of the Druidic world. Across the water, in the islands that the Romans called Britain and Hibernia, the old ways held on longer. Claudius had put an army into Britain by then. But an army in the southeast is not a conquered island. The west and the north were still their own country, and Ireland lay entirely beyond Roman reach. The Druids retreated to the western edge of the known world, and there, in the mist and the rain and the ancient hills, they preserved something that had been lost on the continent. The Romans knew this, and they knew that as long as the Druids survived in Britain, the tribes of that island would never truly accept Roman rule. The Druids were not just priests, they were the organizers of resistance. They were the ones who could travel between tribes, speaking a common language of law and ritual, binding the scattered kingdoms together against the common enemy. They were the nerve center of opposition, and the Romans understood that to conquer Britain, they would have to cut that nerve. The opportunity came in the year 60, or possibly 61, depending on which reading of Tacitus you find convincing, during the reign of the Emperor Nero. A Roman governor named Suetonius Paulinus had been campaigning in Wales, crushing the tribes of the West with the brutal efficiency that Roman legions were famous for. And he learned that the Druids of Britain had gathered on the island of Mona, which we call Anglesey today. It was their sanctuary, their holy of holies, the place where the last great groves still stood, and where the last generation of fully trained Druids still taught their students. If Anglesey fell, the Druidic tradition in Britain would fall with it. Tacitus gives us the account, and it is one of the most chilling passages in all of Roman literature. Paulinus marched his legions to the Menai Strait, the narrow strip of water that separates Anglesey from the mainland. And there, waiting for them on the far shore, were the defenders of the grove. But they were not an army, not in any conventional sense. Tacitus describes women moving among the ranks in the black clothing of mourners, hair loose and streaming, torches burning in their hands like furies. Among them were the Druids themselves, raising their arms to the sky and screaming curses in a language the Romans could not understand. The legionaries hesitated. These were not soldiers. They were priests and women and madmen. To attack them felt like sacrilege, even to Romans who had been ordered to destroy them, but their officers drove them forward. Tacitus says the infantry went over in flat-bottomed boats, while the cavalry forded the shallows or swam their horses across, shields raised against whatever fell among them, and the strait was crossed. What followed was not a battle. It was a massacre. The defenders had no armor, no formation, no weapons that could stop a Roman sword. The Druids stood among the oaks, still chanting, still calling down their curses, while the legionaries cut them down. The women threw their torches at the Roman shields and were killed. The students, who had spent 10 years learning the names of the stars and the properties of herbs, died with their teachers. The grove burned. The sacred pools were fouled with blood. And when it was over, Paulinus had his victory, and the last great centre of Druidic learning in Britain was a smoking ruin. I have read Tacitus's description many times, and I am always struck by the image of the Druids standing among the trees with their arms raised, screaming at an army that did not speak their language and did not fear their gods. It is one of the most defenseless images anywhere in ancient history. They were not stupid. They must have known that curses would not stop iron. But they had spent their lives believing that the grove was protected by powers older than Rome. They had spent their lives in a world where words had force, where the correct ritual at the correct moment could turn back a storm or part a sea. And they died trying to use that force against an enemy that had already decided that the only real power was the power to kill. But the story does not end with the massacre. Because while Paulinus was destroying the Druids in the west, something was happening in the east that would nearly cost him everything. A queen named Boudicca was rising. Her tribe, the Iceni, had been humiliated by Roman officials. She had been flogged. Her daughters had been raped. And she had gathered an army of tribes that were outraged not just by Roman cruelty, but by Roman impiety. The destruction of Anglesey was fresh in everyone's mind. The Druids were dead or scattered or in hiding. And the tribes that had looked to them for spiritual leadership were suddenly leaderless, angry, and afraid. The connection between the two events is impossible to prove with certainty, but I have never managed to believe there was none. Boudicca's revolt exploded within weeks of the Anglesey massacre. She burned 3 Roman cities to the ground and killed thousands of colonists. Paulinus had to abandon his victory in Wales and march his legions east at forced pace to save the province. He won in the end. Boudicca was defeated, and she died, probably by poison, rather than fall into Roman hands. But the revolt showed the Romans something they had not fully understood. The Druids were not just priests. They were the glue that held the tribes together. Without them, the tribes were unpredictable. They were dangerous. They were capable of atrocities that made the Wicker Man look like a campfire story. And so the Roman policy shifted. They did not try to eradicate every trace of Celtic religion. That was impossible. Instead, they tried to control it. They allowed local cults to continue as long as they did not challenge Roman authority. They built temples to Roman gods on the sites of old groves, hoping that the sacred geography would transfer its power to the new religion. They recruited Celtic nobles into the Roman system, giving them citizenship and offices in exchange for loyalty. It was a slower, more patient form of conquest than Paulinus's massacre, but in the long run, it was more effective. The Druids were gone. The old law was forgotten. The songs that took a generation to learn were replaced by Latin hymns that any child could memorize from a book. By the end of the 1st century, the Druidic order in Britain was broken. In Gaul, it was already a memory. The golden sickles were buried in hoards or melted down. The students who had begun their training in the year 50 were dead or scattered, and the ones who survived carried an education they would never be able to finish, because every man who held the rest of it was ash. That is the part people miss. A half-trained druid is not a druid. He is a man who knows some songs, some remedies, and the opening stretch of a legal system whose remainder is now ash, with no living teacher left anywhere who could hand him the rest of it. The Romans had won, and in winning, they had created a silence so complete that we are still trying to hear what was lost. The Romans left accounts. They left roads and walls and coins with the faces of emperors stamped into bronze. But the Druids left nothing. No books, no inscriptions, no buildings with their names carved above the door. If you want to find them now, you have to look in the places where the earth itself has kept the secret. You have to look in the bog. In 1984, workers cutting peat in a Cheshire bog near the town of Wilmslow found something on the conveyor that was not peat. It was part of a human leg. And when the archaeologists came and lifted the rest of him out of the acidic water that had held him for 2,000 years, they found a young man lying face down and naked in the dark, his body drawn up on itself, his face turned into the peat as though he were looking for something beneath the surface. They called him Lindomam, and he has become one of the most important pieces of evidence we have for what the Druids actually did, because his body tells a story that no Roman historian ever wrote. He was not a peasant. That much is clear from his hands. His fingernails were manicured, smooth, and well kept. The kind of hands that belonged to someone who did not spend his days digging in fields. His beard was trimmed with precision. His hair was styled. He wore a fox fur armband and a cord of sinew around his neck. And his last meal, preserved in his stomach by the chemistry of the bog, was a scorched griddle cake of wheat and barley. Among the crumbs of it, the annalists found something else. A few grains of mistletoe pollen. I remember reading about that detail for the first time and feeling the hair go up on my arms. Mistletoe. The plant that Pliny described being cut with a golden sickle on the 6th day of the moon. The soul of the oak. The bridge between worlds. This young man had eaten something with mistletoe in it in the last hours of his life, and then somebody had killed him. And then I read further, and I had to put the excitement back in its box, and I would rather do that in front of you than quietly off screen. A few grains of pollen is a very small thing to hang a religion on. Mistletoe flowers in late winter and early spring. Pollen travels. It gets into flour, onto griddles, onto hands, into the air of any room where somebody has brought a branch indoors. The most defensible thing those grains tell us is the season of his death, which was somewhere around March or April. It might be the residue of a sacred draught. It might be the residue of the weather. I want it to be the first one. Wanting is not evidence, and you should be suspicious of anyone, including me, who hands you a shiver they cannot pay for. However he died, he did not die quickly, and he did not die cleanly. He was struck twice on the top of the head, hard enough to drive fragments of bone inward, hard enough to drop a man without obviously finishing him. There was a cord of animal sinew around his neck, and the vertebrae underneath it were broken. There was a wound across the throat, and then he went into the water. That is the sequence you will find in most accounts, and it is the sequence that produces the phrase you have probably heard. The triple death. A killing so thorough that it closes every door at once. Struck, throttled, bled. It is a genuinely arresting idea, and it lines up with deaths that turn up in Irish myth, where kings die 3 ways in a single moment. I have to slow down here, because this is exactly the point where the retelling runs out ahead of the evidence, and I've been guilty of it myself. Not everyone accepts that sequence. R.C. Connolly, an anthropologist at Liverpool, has argued for years that the cartilage of the throat shows none of the damage you would expect from strangulation, that the sinew around the neck is a necklace that shrank as it got wet, and that several of the injuries could have come from the crushing weight of 2,000 years of peat, or from the machinery that dug him out. Others argue the cord was never a garrote at all, but a tourniquet, used to control the bleeding once the throat was opened. There is no consensus. What there is a man with terrible injuries and a great deal of careful argument about which of them killed him, which happened afterward, and which the bog itself inflicted on a body that could not object. The question that has haunted researchers ever since is why? Why would a community kill one of its own members with such ritual precision? Why the mistletoe? Why the bog? The bogs of Northern Europe were not garbage dumps to the people who lived near them. They were threshold places, neither land nor water, neither alive nor dead in the ordinary sense. The peat formed slowly from the remains of plants that had died but not fully decayed, preserved by the acidic water into something that was neither soil nor stone. To place something in a bog was to place it outside the normal world. It was to send it to a place where time moved differently, where the usual rules did not apply. Weapons were thrown into bogs. Cauldrons were sunk there. Offerings of gold and jewelry were cast into the dark water, not to hide them, but to give them to something on the other side. And sometimes, it seems, people were offered too. The theory that has always appealed to me is that lindoman was an aversion sacrifice. The Romans were coming. Everyone in Britain knew it by the middle of the 1st century. The legions were marching west. The Druids of Anglesey were gathering. And somewhere, in a community that still held to the old ways, a decision was made to offer something of tremendous value to turn back the tide. Not a criminal, not a slave. A high-status young man, someone whose death would actually register with the powers being petitioned. Someone prepared, made ready, sent across the boundary carrying a message into the dark water. Now let me hand you the problem with my own theory, because it is a real one and you deserve it. The radiocarbon dates for lindoman are frustratingly wide. Somewhere between 2 years before the Common Era and 119 years after it. That range is broad enough to include the invasion, which is what my version of the story needs. But it is also broad enough to place his death decades before Rome was even a rumor in Cheshire, or decades after the Romans had arrived and outlawed precisely this kind of killing. If he died in the year 100, he was not offered up to stop an invasion that had already happened and finished. He was killed for some other reason entirely in a province that was supposed to have given this up. So I hold it loosely. It is the version I find most moving, and I have noticed over the years that the version I find most moving is not reliably the version that is true. What is not in doubt is the man himself. Whatever was done to him, and whatever it was done for, he lay in that bog for 2,000 years, his mouth in the mud, his fox-fur armband slowly staining, waiting for a spade to finally tell his story. And in all that time, nobody said his name, because nobody had it to say. The body outlasted the name by 20 centuries. Whatever he died for, the world he died in ended not long after, and his name was gone before his body had even settled into the peat. He is not the only one either. Ireland has bog bodies of its own, and 2 of the most important came out of the Midlands in the same year, a few months and a few miles apart. The peat had been holding them since the Iron Age. The first was found near Clergyman in County Meath. He was a small man, and he had gone to considerable trouble over his appearance. His hair was piled up on the crown of his head, and fixed there with a resin that had been carried to Ireland from somewhere along the coast of France or Spain, which is a very long way for a jar of hair product to travel in the centuries before the Common Era. Somebody opened his skull with an axe. The second came out of a bog at Crowhan Hill in County Offaly, and he was the opposite sort of man. He was enormous, comfortably over 6 feet, which would have made him a giant among the people who knew him. His hands were soft, and his fingernails were manicured, exactly like the Cheshire Man's, the hands of somebody who had never worked a field in his life. His last meal was milk and grain. He had been stabbed. His arms had been pierced and threaded through with rods of hazel. His nipples had been cut, and then he had been severed at the waist. That last detail is the one that changed how these bodies get read. In early Irish kingship, a man submitted to his lord by sucking his lord's nipples. To cut them was to make a man permanently unfit to be king, and to do it to a corpse was to say something about that corpse which everyone standing there would have understood immediately. Both men were found on old tribal boundaries, on the seams between kingdoms. Eamon Kelly, who spent years as keeper of Irish antiquities at the National Museum, argued that these were not random victims at all. They were failed sovereigns, killed on the edge of the territory they had failed, handed back to a land they had not managed to keep fertile. I want to say plainly that this is an interpretation and not a fact, and that it is elegant, and that elegant is always worth a second look. But it does something the horror stories never manage. It puts these deaths inside a system rather than leaving them as atrocity. And a system is exactly the sort of thing a druid would have been there to run. The bogs did not only take people, though. During the Second World War, as the world was tearing itself apart in a different kind of violence, another discovery was made on Anglesey itself. Engineers were building a runway for an airfield near a lake called Linn Cerrig Bark, and as they worked, they began pulling objects from the peat. Not one or two. Something in the order of 150 pieces of worked metal, every one of them out of place. Slave chains, iron swords, bronze cauldrons, chariot fittings, spearheads, a trumpet, a gang chain designed to bind multiple prisoners together at the neck. All of it had been deliberately thrown into the water. None of it was lost by accident. The sheer scale of the deposit is staggering. This was not a casual offering. It was a sustained practice, carried out over generations, perhaps centuries. The lake was a mouth, and the community kept feeding it. Weapons that had seen battle were bent or broken before being cast into the water, as if to kill them before they entered the other world. The cauldron, that great symbol of Celtic plenty and sacred feasting, was given to the depths. The gang chain, that instrument of human cruelty, went into the water empty, so far as anyone has ever been able to tell, though nobody who has stood and looked at it has managed to stop wondering. When I read about Linn Cerrig Bark, I think of Tacitus and his description of Anglesey. He wrote that the groves there were given over to cruel superstitions, that the altars were drenched with the blood of captives, that the Druids read the future in human entrails. He was writing about the years before Paulinus crossed the strait, and he was writing from somebody else's report at second hand, about an island he never saw. I have to be exact about how I set these two things side by side, because the tempting move is to say that the lake proves the historian, and it does not. Llyn Cerrig Bach contains no altars. It contains no bodies. What it contains is metal, thrown into water deliberately, over a very long stretch of time. It does not corroborate a single word. Tacitus wrote about blood. What it does corroborate is something narrower, and to my mind, more interesting. Anglesey really was a place where people gave things away to the water, seriously and repeatedly across generations. Tacitus said the island was a religious center of the first importance. The lake says the island was a religious center of the first importance. That is where the agreement ends, and stopping there is more honest than letting a bronze cauldron stand in for a slaughtered captive, because the second one makes a better story. But the objects at Llyn Cerrig Bach also tell a quieter story. They show us that the Druids were not just philosophers in white robes. They were the administrators of an economy of sacrifice that bound the entire community together. The warrior who offered his sword after a battle was not just making a religious gesture. He was acknowledging that his victory belonged to the gods, not to himself. The farmer who threw a harvest offering into the water was participating in a system of exchange that kept the tribe in good standing with the forces that controlled rain and sun and the fertility of the soil. The slave chain suggests something darker, that human beings were sometimes part of this economy too, given to the water in the same way that weapons were given, as objects of value returned to their source. And then the offering stopped. The Romans came. The community that had fed the lake for centuries was scattered or killed or absorbed into the empire, and the lake went quiet. The water continued to rise and fall with the seasons, but no more swords were cast into it. No more cauldrons sank slowly through the peat. The mouth was still open, but there was no one left who remembered what to feed it. This is the tragedy of the Druids. It is not simply that they were killed. It is that they were designed to be killed in a very specific way. The Romans understood something about them that we sometimes forget. A Druid was not a soldier. You could not defeat him by cutting him down in battle, though they did that too. A Druid was a library. He was a walking, breathing repository of everything his tribe knew about law and medicine and astronomy and theology and history. And because the Druids wrote nothing down, the death of a single trained Druid was the burning of a library that had taken most of a lifetime to fill. The Romans called it conquest, but I think we need a different word for what they actually did. Nemocide, the killing of memory. It was deliberate, systematic, and ultimately more thorough than any massacre of warriors could have been. You can replace dead soldiers. You cannot replace a dead library. And the Druids were the libraries of the Celtic world. Imagine what was lost. A medical tradition that had been refined over centuries, knowledge of plants and minerals, and the human body that had been tested by trial and error until it worked. An astronomical tradition capable of holding the lunar and the solar year in agreement with one another, which is the one fragment of that work we can still put our hands on. A legal code as complex as anything Rome produced, governing marriage and property and injury and inheritance, all of it memorized and transmitted without a single written statute. A theology that explained the origin of the world, the nature of the gods, the fate of the soul after death, and the proper relationship between humanity and the living landscape. Poetry that had been composed and refined over hundreds of years, epic cycles that made the Greek Iliad look like a pamphlet, all of it carried in human minds, all of it dependent on a continuous chain of teachers and students stretching back into prehistory. And then the chain broke. When the last Druid who had come through the whole of that training died on Anglesey, or in a hidden glade somewhere in Ireland, or in a Roman prison, the last copy of that library died with him. There were no manuscripts to consult, no scrolls in a monastery that someone could dig up later. The Romans had burned the groves, and the groves were the only shelves. The students who were partway through the course were not far enough along to reconstruct what they had never been taught. The fragments that survived were just that. Fragments, a healing charm here, a legal proverb there. A story about a king and a druid that had been simplified and retold so many times that the original meaning was half lost. I sometimes try to imagine what it would feel like to be the last person who knew something, to be the only living human being who could recite a particular poem, or perform a particular ritual, or explain why a certain plant was gathered at a certain time of year. To carry that weight in your head, knowing that when you died, it would be as if the thing had never existed at all. The last Druid must have known this. He must have felt the accumulated voices of 1,000 years pressing against the inside of his skull, begging him not to let them go silent. And he must have known, if he had any sense of the world around him, that there was no one left to pass them to. But the story is not quite over, because the memory did not die completely. It went underground. It hid in the places where the Romans could not reach or did not bother to look. In Ireland, which the Romans never conquered, the old stories survived longer, not in the groves. The groves were gone even there, cut down by time and Christianity and the slow erosion of memory. But in the scriptoriums of Christian monks, something unexpected happened. The monks came to Ireland in the 5th and 6th centuries, and they found a population that still knew the old stories. They still spoke of Cú Chulainn and the cattle raid of Cooley. They still remembered the names of the old gods, the battles of the north, and the druids who had prophesied and judged and sung. It took a couple of 100 years before anyone began committing that material to parchment in earnest. And the manuscripts we can actually hold today are later still, 12th century copies of copies of copies. But somewhere in the scriptoriums, literate men with a passion for preservation started writing these stories down. They did not do it faithfully, not in the way a modern anthropologist would. They were Christians, and they reshaped the material to fit their own understanding of the world. The old gods became fairies, or demons, or ancient kings. The Druids became magicians, or poets, or wise men who were sometimes admirable and sometimes dangerous. The theology was stripped out, or Christianized, or simply lost because the monks did not understand it well enough to record it. But the stories survived. The names survived. And in the pages of the Book of Leinster and the Book of the Dun Cow, in the Book of Invasions and the cattle raid of Cooley, we can still hear the echoes of a world that had already vanished before the first monk sharpened a quill to record it. I am grateful to those monks, even though I know they got a lot of things wrong. Without them, we would not know the name of Amagin. We would not know that Cathbad prophesied the sorrow of Deirdre. We would not have the Song of Amagin itself, that strange and powerful poem that claims identity with the wind and the sea and the salmon in the pool. The monks preserved the sound of the voice, even if they did not always understand the words. But what they preserved was only the surface. The deep structure is gone. The whole apparatus of training, the precise rituals, the astronomical calculations, the medical knowledge, the legal reasoning, all of it slipped through the fingers of history like water. We have the stories, but we do not have the system that produced them. We have the characters, but we do not have the curriculum that created them. We have the echoes, but the voice that made the original sound is silent. And so we are left with the silence. The grove is still there, in 1,000 places across the old Celtic lands. The oak still grows. The mistletoe still appears on the winter branches, green against the brown, suspended between earth and sky. But there is no one left who knows the words to cut it. No one left who can read the flight of birds and know whether the tribe should plant or wait. No one left who can stand between two armies and command them to stop and be obeyed. The Romans won, and in the space where the Druids had stood, there is only the wind moving through empty branches and the sound of water in a bog, and the faint, distant memory of a voice that once knew everything. The silence lasted a long time. Not the silence of the grove, where the wind still moved through the branches and the water still dripped from the moss. I mean the silence of forgetting. For more than 1,000 years, the Druids were gone, and nobody missed them. The Christians had built their churches on the old places and given them new names. The forests had been cut for timber and cleared for sheep. The bogs had been drained. The laws that had lived in the heads of living men were replaced by laws written on parchment and enforced by men with swords and seals. The world had moved on. And then, slowly, it began to move back. The change did not come from the countryside. It came from the cities, from the places where the old ways had been buried, the deepest under cobblestones and soot. In the 18th century, Europe began to choke on its own smoke. The mills rose along the rivers. The factories swallowed the fields. The air turned grey, and the rivers turned black. And people who had grown up smelling horse dung and hay began to smell coal tar and iron. Something was being lost. Not a specific thing that you could name, but a feeling. A sense that the world had once been wider, stranger, and more alive than the ledgers and the machines allowed. This was Romanticism, though the people who lived it did not call it that. It was a hunger for the wild, for the ancient, for the unmeasured. And in Britain, that hunger found a very specific object. The Druids. They began to reappear not in groves, but in drawing rooms. Not as priests, but as symbols. The first organized group to call themselves Druids in more than a millennium had nothing to do with religion. At least, not in the way the ancient Druids would have understood it. On the 28th of November in 1781, a carpenter and surveyor named Henry Hurle sat down with a group of friends in the King's Arms Tavern on Poland Street, just off Oxford Street in London, and founded something he called the Ancient Order of Druids. It was a fraternal society, a club. Men would meet in taverns, wear white aprons, perform rituals that were loosely based on Freemasonry, and call each other Druids. They did not believe in the old gods. They did not memorize law or study herbs. They drank ale, sang songs, and enjoyed the feeling of belonging to something older than the banks and the counting houses that were swallowing the city around them. I do not think we should laugh at them too hard. They were playing at dressing up, yes, but they were playing at it because they needed something that their world was not giving them, a sense of mystery, a sense of connection to the land beneath the pavement. The Ancient Order of Druids was not a revival of Celtic religion. It was a symptom of industrial loneliness. But the symbol they had chosen was about to take on a life of its own, because something else was happening on Salisbury Plain that would give the imaginary Druids a stage. Stonehenge is older than the Druids by millennia. The Great Stone Circle was built in stages, beginning around 5,000 years ago, by people who lived and died long before the first Celtic language was spoken in Britain. The Druids of the Iron Age may have known the monument. They may have performed rituals there, or they may have avoided it as the work of an older and stranger people. We do not know. But in the 18th century, nobody knew the true age of the stones. Archaeology was barely born. To the gentleman scholars who rode out from London to sketch the ruins, Stonehenge looked like exactly the kind of place where ancient priests would have gathered. It was circular, like a grove. It was aligned with the sun. It was mysterious, impressive, and conveniently lacking any written explanation, so they gave it one. Stonehenge, they declared, was a Druid temple. There is something almost painfully ironic about this. The real Druids, as far as we can tell, worshipped in groves. They chose living trees over dead stone. They would probably have found the idea of a stone temple to be a strange and foreign concept, more Roman than Celtic. But the Victorians and Georgians who adopted Stonehenge as their spiritual headquarters did not care about historical accuracy. They cared about atmosphere. And Stonehenge had atmosphere to spare. By the early 19th century, the connection was fixed in the public mind. Druids meant Stonehenge. Stonehenge meant Druids. The fact that the monument had been built by a completely different civilization, 2,500 years before anyone had ever heard of a Druid, was a detail that would not become widely known until the 20th century. By then, it was too late. The image had stuck. But the most important figure in this revival was not Henry Hurle, and he was not an English gentleman antiquarian riding out to sketch stones. He was a Welsh stonemason named Edward Williams, and he was one of the most remarkable liars in the history of Britain. Williams was born in 1747 in Glamorgan in the south of Wales. He was a poet, a dreamer, a political radical, and an opium addict. He loved Wales with a fierce and desperate love, and he hated the fact that his country had been so thoroughly dominated by England that its own language and history were slipping away. He wanted Wales to have a glorious past, and when the past would not cooperate, he decided to invent one. He taught himself to write in an archaic form of Welsh. He produced manuscripts that he claimed were ancient, copied from sources so old that nobody else had seen them. He wrote poetry that he attributed to medieval bards who had never existed. He created an entire system of Druidic philosophy, complete with theology, ritual instructions, and a calendar of festivals, and he presented it all as the recovered wisdom of the ancient Celtic past. He took the name Iolo Morganwg, which means something like Ned of Glamorgan, and under that name he became the most influential forger in British history. In 1792, on the 21st of June, Iolo Morganwg climbed Primrose Hill in London with a small group of followers. He carried a sword and a handful of pebbles he had brought along in his pocket. He laid the pebbles out on the grass in a circle. He declared the ground inside it sacred, and he performed a ceremony that he called the Gorsedd, a gathering of bards, which he claimed was the authentic ritual of the ancient Druids. There were no white robes that day, whatever the paintings tell you. The costume everyone pictures came the better part of a century later. What Iolo had was ribbon, cut into lengths and handed out by rank. White for the Druid, blue for the bard, green for the ovate. He spoke in Welsh. He drew the sword and sheathed it again. And he declared that the tradition of the Druids, which had been suppressed by the Romans and forgotten by the world, was now restored. Every word of it was nonsense. The ceremony was a mix of Masonic ritual, Welsh folk custom, and Iolo's own imagination. The ancient sources he cited were his own forgeries. The Druidic theology he preached had been invented in his opium dreams. Scholars would spend the next 2 centuries untangling his lies, and they are still finding them. Iorwerth Morganwg polluted the historical record so thoroughly that serious scholars of Celtic religion still have to warn their students not to trust anything that sounds too neat, too poetic, or too conveniently Welsh. And yet, I find it hard to hate him, even though he was a liar, because his lies were born from a kind of love. He wanted Wales to matter. He wanted his people to have a past they could be proud of, a tradition that could stand beside the classical heritage of Greece and Rome. And, in a strange way, he succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. The Gorseth that he invented on Primrose Hill in 1792 became real. In 1819, the Welsh Eisteddfod, the great national festival of poetry and music, adopted Iorwerth's ceremony as its official opening. The arch-druid, wearing the white robe and the crown of oak leaves, still stands in a stone circle today and proclaims the gathering open. The British monarch has been made an honorary member of it. The tradition that Iorwerth Morganwg invented out of nothing at all has now been running, continuously and sincerely, for well over 2 centuries, which is longer than a great many institutions we treat without hesitation as ancient. And it is held in a reverence that would have astonished the stonemason who first dreamed it up in a laudanum haze. That is the strange thing about forgery. If enough people believe it for long enough, it stops being a lie and starts being a culture. The ancient Druids would not have recognized Iorwerth's ceremony. But Iorwerth's ceremony has now been performed for more than 200 years by people who believe in it sincerely. It has inspired poets, musicians, and nationalists who kept the Welsh language alive when it was in danger of dying. It has given a small country a sense of itself. I'm not sure whether that justifies the deception, but I am sure that the world is more interesting with Iorwerth Morganwg in it than without him. By the middle of the 19th century, the image of the Druid had become fixed in the Victorian imagination, and it had almost nothing to do with the Iron Age reality. The Victorian Druid was a harmless old man with a long white beard, wearing a white nightshirt and a crown of oak leaves, standing in a stone circle at dawn. He was gentle, mystical, and slightly ridiculous. He looked like someone's eccentric uncle who had wandered away from a costume party and gotten lost on the moor. He was not a judge who could stop a battle. He was not a doctor who knew the poison in every root. He was not the keeper of a law that took most of a lifetime to learn. He was a mascot. This was the Great Shrinking, and it happened to the Druids, just as it happened to the fairies and the Green Man. The same industrial society that had created the hunger for the ancient past also tamed the object of that hunger into something safe. The fairy became a tiny winged creature who left coins under pillows. The Green Man became a decorative face on a pub sign. And the Druid became a white-robed mystic who posed for paintings and opened garden feats. The terrifying authority of the real Druid, the man who could excommunicate a king, was replaced by a figure so gentle that he seemed to pose no threat to anyone. I sometimes wonder what a real Druid would think if he could see what became of his memory. If Cathbad walked into one of those Victorian stone circle ceremonies, with the white robes and the polite speeches and the cucumber sandwiches, I suspect he would be furious. Or perhaps he would be amused. Or perhaps he would simply not understand what he was looking at. The gap between the world that produced him and the world that remembered him had grown too wide to cross. But the Victorians did not just shrink the Druid, they also preserved him. In their own strange way, They kept the name alive. They built a mythology around it. They painted pictures of Druids at Stonehenge that hung in parlors across the empire. They wrote poems about the mistletoe and the golden sickle that schoolchildren memorized. They created an image that was false in almost every detail, but was emotionally true in a way that mattered. People needed to believe that there had once been wise men in white robes who understood the secrets of nature. They needed it because their own world of factories and railways and telegraphs felt like it was losing something essential. The Druid became a symbol of that loss, and so he waited. The white-robed ghost of a memory that had never really existed in the form that people imagined. He stood in the stone circles at dawn, harmless and picturesque, while the real groves rotted and the real knowledge dissolved into the peat. He was a placeholder, a bookmark in history, holding a page for someone who might come back later and read it properly. That someone would arrive in the 20th century, but they would not be wearing white robes, and they would not be looking for mystery in the pages of Iolo Morganwg's forgeries. They would be looking for something older, something that had survived the forgetting in places where the Victorians had not thought to look. They would be looking for the Druid, not as a costume, but as a function, a way of standing in the world, a way of listening to what the trees were still trying to say. The 20th century should have been the end of the Druid. The world wars came and went, and the gods of the machine seemed to have won every battle that mattered. Science had explained the stars. Medicine had replaced the herbalist. The law was written in books that anyone could read, and judges wore wigs instead of oak leaves. The grove was a park now, fenced and labelled, and the mistletoe was something you kissed under at Christmas. The white-robed Victorian ghost had faded into the wallpaper of history, and there was no reason to think he would ever rise again. But he did. And the strange thing is that he rose not from the pages of Iolo Morganwg's forgeries, and not from the stone circles where the Victorians had posed him, but from the same hunger that had created the Victorians in the first place. The hunger for something older than the factory. The hunger for a world that spoke back. In 1964, a man named Ross Nichols founded something called the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids. He was a Cambridge-trained historian, a published poet and a painter, and for a decade before that he had been a member, and then the chairman of an older group, the Ancient Druid Order. His closest companion in all of this was Gerald Gardner, the man who did for modern witchcraft roughly what Nichols was about to do for modern druidry. The two of them had met years earlier at a naturist club in Hertfordshire. Of all the unlikely places to lay the foundations of a religious movement, and between them they worked out the eightfold year, the wheel of solstices and equinoxes and cross-quarter days that almost every modern pagan now keeps. Gardner folded it into Wicca immediately. The old Druid order would not have it. And when Gardner and the order's chief both died in the same year, Nichols walked out and started his own thing. He knew his history well enough to understand that the ancient Druids were gone and that the Victorian Druids were mostly fantasy. But he also understood that a symbol does not need to be historically accurate to be spiritually necessary. What mattered was not whether the ancient Druids had actually organized themselves into three grades called Bard, Ovate, and Druid. What mattered was whether those three words still meant something to people who were starving for a connection to the land. Nichols took the structure from the classical sources, or at least from what the Roman writers had claimed to see. The bard was the voice, the ovate was the seer, the druid was the sage. He built a curriculum around these three paths, a course of study that could be completed by correspondence, through the mail, by people living in cities and suburbs who had never seen an oak grove except in photographs. It was a modern invention from top to bottom. And it worked. The order of bards, ovates and druids grew slowly at first, and then faster as the 20th century wore on, and more people began to feel that the religions they had inherited were not speaking to the condition of the modern world. Christianity had become, for many, a matter of dogma and institution. The New Age movements offered crystals and astrology, but lacked the depth of a real tradition. What Nichols offered was something different. He offered roots. Not literal roots in the soil of ancient Gaul, but metaphorical roots in the idea that wisdom could be drawn from the natural world if you learned how to pay attention. I want to be clear about something here, because it matters. Modern Druidry is not a reconstruction of the ancient religion. Anyone who tells you that is either lying or misinformed. We do not know enough about the ancient Druids to reconstruct anything. We do not know their prayers. We do not know their full calendar. We do not know the words they spoke when they cut the mistletoe. What modern Druidry is, instead, is a reimagining. It takes the fragments that history has left us, the mistletoe and the oak and the 3 grades and the groves, and it builds something new from them. It is a creative act, not an archaeological one. And in that sense, it is probably closer in spirit to what Iolo Morganwg was doing than its practitioners would like to admit. The difference is that modern Druids are honest about it. They do not claim to be recovering a lost tradition. They claim to be creating a living one. And the center of that living tradition, the place where the modern Druid most visibly meets the ancient symbol, is a monument that the ancient Druids probably never used. Stonehenge is still there. It has survived 5,000 years of rain and frost, and the footsteps of millions of tourists. It sits on the plain like a stone clock that nobody fully understands. And every year at the summer solstice, a strange thing happens. Thousands of people gather in the darkness before dawn. They wear robes, or they wear jeans. They carry drums, or they carry cameras. Some are Druids in the modern sense, members of orders and groves and circles. Some are pagans of other kinds, Wiccans and heathens, and people who do not know what to call themselves. Some are just curious. Some are drunk. And as the first light begins to stain the eastern sky, they wait. The modern Druid at Stonehenge is a figure of genuine sincerity and genuine absurdity, often at the same time. He may be wearing a white robe and carrying a staff, or he may be wearing a shirt with the name of his favorite band on it. He may have spent years studying the old texts, or he may have wandered over from the beer tent at 10 minutes to dawn. The English Heritage Organization, which manages the monument, has had a complicated relationship with these gatherings. For years, they tried to restrict access. There were protests, arrests, confrontations between robed protesters and police in fluorescent jackets. The Druids claimed a religious right to be there. The authorities claimed a duty to protect a fragile archaeological site. Both sides were partly right. And yet, when I see photographs of the solstice dawn at Stonehenge, with the robed figures standing in the stone circle and the light coming through the lintels, I understand why people keep coming back. The emotion is real, even if the history is wrong. The need is real. The monument is real, even if the people who built it would not recognize the rituals being performed in their name. A place can become sacred not because of what happened there in the past, but because of what people bring to it in the present. Stonehenge is a vessel, and the modern Druids have poured their longing into it, and the vessel has held. I think the ancient Druids would have understood this better than the archaeologists do. They knew that a place becomes holy through presence and attention, not through historical documentation. The grove was sacred because people had made it sacred, generation after generation, until the soil itself seemed to hum with accumulated reverence. Stonehenge has become a grove in that sense. Not because of the stones, but because of the people who keep gathering among them year after year in the dark, waiting for the light. But modern Druidry is not really about Stonehenge. That is just the most photogenic part of it. The deeper work happens in smaller places, in groves that have been reconsecrated, in parks and forests and private gardens across Britain and Ireland and America and Australia. It happens in the study groups where people learn the old Welsh triads and compose new poetry in the bardic style. It happens in the healing practices where modern ovates study herbalism with a seriousness that would have impressed their ancient predecessors, even if their pharmacology is more sophisticated. It happens in the environmental activism where modern Druids protest road building through ancient woodlands, drawing on a spiritual authority that is only a few decades old, but feels like it comes from the bedrock of the island itself. Because that, I think, is where the Druid has found his most urgent modern voice, not in the robe, not in the staff, not in the solstice ceremony, but in the defense of the living world against the forces that would pave it over. We live in an age of concrete and screens, of digital abstraction and a profound disconnection from the sources of our own lives. Most of us do not know where our water comes from. We do not know the names of the trees on our street. We have forgotten that the soil is alive, that the air is a community of breaths, that the seasons are not inconveniences to be managed by central heating and air conditioning, but the fundamental rhythm of existence. We have built a world that treats nature as a resource, a warehouse of raw materials, and we are beginning to see the bill come due. The modern Druid stands against this, or tries to. He is not a scientist, though many Druids are scientifically literate. He is not a politician, though many are politically active. He is a reminder. He stands in the grove, or what is left of it, and he says that the oak is older than your nation, that the river remembers your grandfather's name, and that the mistletoe still grows between two worlds, whether you notice it or not. He is a voice for the voiceless, which in this case means the non-human world that has no vote and no stock portfolio and no lobbyist in the corridors of power. There is something genuinely moving in that role. It is not the role of the ancient Druid, exactly. The ancient Druid served a tribe. He was the memory of a specific people, bound to a specific landscape, responsible for a specific herd of cattle, and a specific field of grain. The modern Druid serves something more diffuse. The planet, perhaps. Or the idea of the sacred in nature. Or simply the human need to feel that we are part of something larger than ourselves. But the function is similar. He's still the one who pays attention when everyone else is looking at their phone. He is still the one who remembers that the world is alive. And in this sense, the Druid connects to something even older than the Iron Age. He connects to the green man, that face of leaves and branches that peers from the corners of medieval churches, the spirit of the wild, that keeps reappearing no matter how many times civilization tries to wall it out. The modern Druid and the green man are cousins, if not brothers. They both represent the refusal of the natural world to stay dead. They both remind us that the concrete cracks, that the ivy finds a way, that the oak will outlast the empire that cut down its grove. The Druid has survived his own death. He was killed by Rome, forgotten by Christianity, shrunk into a costume by the Victorians, and dismissed by the modern world as a harmless eccentric in a white robe. And yet, here he is, standing in a stone circle at dawn, protesting a motorway that would destroy a sacred grove, teaching a child the names of the plants in a hedgerow, composing a poem that no one will read, but that matters because it was composed with attention and care. He is not what he was. He cannot be. The world that made him is gone, and the 20 years of training that produced him are impossible in a culture that measures education in semesters and credits. But he is still here, in fragments and echoes, in the people who feel the old hunger and try to answer it with the tools they have. The grove still stands. The oak still grows. And somewhere, in the silence between the traffic noise and the hum of the power lines, a voice is still speaking, the old language of root and rain and star. We may not understand the words, but we can still feel the weight of them, pressing against the thin membrane that separates our world from the other one. The Druid is gone, and the Druid is still here, and the conversation between humanity and the wild, the conversation that he tended for so many centuries, has never really stopped. It has only changed its voice, waiting for someone new to learn how to listen. But before we leave the grove, before we step back out into the light of the ordinary world, we need to ask one last question. Why does this matter? Why, after 2,000 years of silence, do we still feel the need to find the Druid? Why do we keep coming back to the grove, even when we know that the grove is a park now, and the Druid is a memory, and the mistletoe is just a plant? It matters because the Druid represents something we have misplaced. Not the white robe or the golden sickle, not even the religion itself, which is gone beyond any hope of recovery. What we have lost is the idea that a single person could hold the whole world in their head. That law and medicine and poetry and astronomy and theology could live in one mind, trained over decades to see connections instead of divisions. We have split these things apart. We have made them into departments and degrees and careers that do not speak to each other. The Druid was the last generalist in a world that has become nothing but specialists. He also matters because he was quiet, because he wrote nothing down. In an age where every thought is logged and archived and turned into data, there is something almost rebellious about a wisdom that refused to be captured. The Druid trusted his voice and his memory, and when he died, that wisdom died with him. It was not safe. It was not efficient. But it was alive in a way that a database is not. So the next time you walk past an oak tree, really look at it. Notice the bark. Notice the moss. Notice the way the light falls through the leaves in late afternoon. That is the cathedral. That has always been the cathedral. And somewhere in the silence between your footsteps and the wind, the old conversation is still going on. The Druid is gone, but the grove remains, and it is still waiting for anyone who chooses to remember and to listen.